All right, so here we are ready to start our next exciting round of Genesis. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen like I always do with PowerPoint. And we will get started. Reading for this time was Genesis 12 through 25. From Abraham to Isaac. But just like last week, we'll start off with just a little review of the lesson before. So, a review of Genesis 1 through 11. We talked about creation last week. We said that when God created the universe, he created it from nothing. And we talked about unique souls, that every soul that God creates is unique. He creates it at the moment of conception and places it in that child in the womb, including Adam and Eve's. And we said that Adam and Eve's humanity are humanity's parents. There was an Adam and Eve, and that couple was the couple that all of creation, all of humanity came from. And we said that their bodies could have evolved. The church doesn't take a stance on that. Then we talked about the fall. We said that the fall was a real event, that original sin is transmitted to us because of that sin that our parents committed. It's transmitted. We don't do it personally, but it wounds our human nature, and it makes us more likely to sin, to be tempted to sin. And it's the reason that creation is no longer in harmony. So a real event. And we talked about that real event. Afterwards, Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise, and that they start procreating, and immediately that original sin cuts in, and there's all sorts of violence, and humanity goes off in this terrible direction. And God decides that he needs to start again. He started with an original couple, and he made a covenant with them that they broke. They ate from the tree of knowledge. And now the earth is filled with men who and women who are not nice people. And so God decides he is going to make a covenant now with one holy family, and that's going to be Noah, his 3 sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. And Noah builds the ark, and again, we said it may have been a worldwide flood, but there's scientific evidence that there was a very large flood in Mesopotamia about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, right around Noah's time. So he makes a new covenant with Noah, and he says that the sign of it will be the rainbow. And once again, as soon as Noah gets off the ark, he gets drunk and humanity starts off in the same kind of awkward direction where they're not following God. And we left off with chapter 11, where man was once again trying to attain heaven without God, and he tries to build mankind tries to build a tower to heaven so that they can get to heaven without God. And God confuses their languages so that they're going to depend on him again. So that was what we covered last week. At the very end of chapter 11, we left off with Abraham, Sarai, and Lot, the nephew of Abraham, Abram, I should say. His name has not been changed by God yet. So Lot's his nephew. They start off here in Ur, and Terah, Abram's father, is alive at that time, and he's the one who decides to move his family up to Haran, and you see that at the top of the page. And just a little bit about Ur. I know that in the morning class last week, I mentioned that there was an archaeological dig at Ur, and that archaeological dig is the ziggurat at Ur. And Ur was this ziggurat, and a ziggurat is a temple. And you'll notice that it really looks like that Tower of Babel that I had a painting of by a famous painter last time. The ziggurats were temples, and they're not exactly sure what ever happened in the temples, but they were massive. And this one was that it is at Ur. This is a drawing of what it would have looked like originally. This is what it looks like now. It was not discovered until the 1920s and 30s. It had been built at about 2000 BC, the 21st century before Christ. And then it was rebuilt in the 6th century by a king because it was crumbling. And then it got covered up by sand. In the 1920s, an archaeologist was going through the desert, and he noticed this sand dune, and he saw at the top of the sand dune that the wind had blown away the sand from the top of this enormous building. So it was excavated, and then Saddam Hussein actually renovated the top part of it. But interestingly enough, when we read about Babylon in the Bible, it talked about how they used bricks that were fired and tar to hold it together. Well, sure enough, that's what the bottom layer of the ziggurat that is from its original 2000 BC time frame was built like. So Ur in its heyday was about 5,000 to 6,000 people. And they probably used the temple, the ziggurat, in some type of worship of the moon god, because that was their primary deity. Terah's family left Ur at about 1800 BC. So just a little bit about the thriving cities of Mesopotamia and beyond. This is a map that shows what life was like with these very busy trade routes. There were basically three centers of civilization back in 1800 BC. One of them was in Egypt. The city was Memphis, and it was along the delta of the Nile, very rich farmland. So that was one population center. Then there was Mesopotamia, which was made up of a whole bunch of little city states of these 5,000, 6,000 if they were very major, and somewhat smaller cities. And you can see them named here at the bottom: Sippar, Eshnuna, and number 10 is Ur. And the interesting thing about Ur is at that time, it was actually a coastal city because the Persian Gulf extended all the way out there. And then due to climate change, the Persian Gulf has moved away, so Ur is no longer on the coast. But at one time, it was in its heyday. What did they trade? They traded gold and silver and copper and lapis and tin. And how did we know that? Well, because we find these materials. This is where they're actually mined at, where it's listed on the map. But we'll find lapis down in Mesopotamia. And that's because they were trading with this other population center up here that was in northern India. And it was called the Harappa. And the Harappas actually had a language, a written language also. But big, long trade routes. Lots of war between the city-states and between all the barbarians that also populated these areas. And in fact, that's what happened to Ur. Ur was thriving, but by the time Terah and his son Abram left and their family, it had been reduced from a city to a town to a village. And that's because a warring tribe had come in and they had just flattened it, all but the ziggurat. And the people had scattered and they didn't come back in. So all of these people were polytheists. They believed in many gods, and they weren't personal gods. They were just God. They knew in their heart there must be gods, and that they were controlling things. And so they would worship many gods, and some cities had primary deities, like Ur had the moon god for its primary deity. So did Haran, where Terah moves his family to. So in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 10, Abraham is called by God, by this God that he didn't know, right? He's a pagan. He worships the moon, but he hears this God tell him to go from your father's house. And God promises him three things. He promises to make him a great nation, to give him land, right? A country. He promises to make him a great name. Well, he can't be a great name unless he has descendants. So he's promising him children, and a great name is a king's name. And he promises blessings for the whole world that are going to come through him. And so Abram listens to this God. It must have been a powerful conversion experience, because as this picture depicts, Abram was not a young man. Sarai was not a young woman, but Abraham responds with obedient faith, we are told. Then in chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, and then again in chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, we hear very similar weird stories, right? We hear about Abram going down to Egypt. If you go back to that map that's at the very back of your book, that's Abram's journey. It was the one that I had on that first slide. And you will see the little arrows that point, and they show him going up to Haran, and then God calls him down to it will be one day called the chosen land. He calls him down to what's going to be given to the Israeli people. If you see the little square cut out in here, it'll show you a close-up. In that close-up square, the bottom body of water would be the Dead Sea. The one right above it, the big lake, that's Galilee. And so he is headed for Bethel and then Hebron. But in this journey, it describes in chapter 12, 10 through 20, that there's a huge famine. And so he's got to go all the way into Egypt, right? I talked about the Nile Delta, the really fertile land. Egypt had food. So Abram heads off for Egypt. And there's this odd story about him being afraid and telling his wife to say she's his sister. And then Pharaoh's harem, you can see them here in the picture that I put on this slide, has come to get Sarah because she's so beautiful that Pharaoh wants her for his harem. But then Pharaoh finds out that she's already married to Abram, and he sends her back along with all sorts of treasure because he's mad at Abram for telling him that this was his sister. And then in chapter 20, we see a very, very similar story, but now he's Abraham, she's Sarah. You know, they're already old in both these stories, and you're going like, what? Well, in my New Jerusalem Bible, there was a footnote that said that this is kind of, remember we talked about in the Bible, the humans are always telling a story, and God is telling a story. And this is one of the human stories, right? We have to understand their culture. And one of the things about their culture and the culture of all these tribes in Mesopotamia at the time, and even our culture today, is we want to be descendant from beautiful people, from powerful people, you know? So here's this story about the beautiful Sarai and Sarah. And, they're so beautiful even in their old age that the Pharaoh or Abimelech wants them for their own. But God is faithful to Abraham. Even though he sends her off with him, God brings her back untarnished. And so that's a little human ad. And I just didn't want to skip over it. Not that it's essential, but you've read it, and if you were like me, your head would have been spinning, going like, "What is going on here?" But there's a little, even my father at the end of his life, he was just convinced that we had descended from Polish royalty, and it was very important to him. And back in those cultures, that was an important thing, that you would come from beautiful, powerful people. So on to Genesis 13. Abram and Lot separate, right? The nephew has come with his uncle. They've gotten lots of treasure. They've gotten big herds. And Abram realizes that because the herdsmen are starting to fight over pasture lands, and Abram doesn't want the family fighting. So he says to Lot, "You choose, Lot. You're going to go one direction. I'm going to go the other, because we got to separate so that we can get these flocks apart. But I'm going to let you choose which way you want to go." And Lot looks over the Jordan Valley and he says, "That's where I want to go." And Abram says, "Okay." And so Abram is left with the land of Canaan. And he moves, if you look on your map, to Hebron. And Hebron is there kind of in the middle of that square. And that's where he is going to take his family and his treasures. So then we get to Genesis 14, and just an interesting historical note. If you look in chapter 14 at verse 8, it's kind of a weird read anyway, because it's got all these kings' names. A war is breaking out between a whole bunch of different tribes, and they're picking their sides. And verse 8 mentions the kings of 5 nations: the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Zor. Well, a lot of secular historians now and secular archaeologists like to say secular meaning they're not religious. They're like, the whole Bible's a myth. It's all made up. And for a long time, people said that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was made up, that there's no Sodom, there's no Gomorrah, really. And, but it was interesting in 1974 in Ebla, what archaeologists will do in Mesopotamia, in that area of the desert, is they go and they find these mounds out in the desert. And what would have happened way back when was a city came in and built itself like Ur did, next to the coast on fertile land, usually near fresh water. And barbarians come in and sack it, and it goes away. But still the land is fertile and there's still fresh water. And so another city comes and builds itself on top of the original city. And then barbarians come in and sack it, and another city, and maybe it's razed by fire, and then another city. Well, these cities, as they build up, make these mounds, and they call them tells, archaeologists do. And they just start at the top of the tell, and they just start digging down to older and older and older cities. Well, Ebla, which was one of those trade centers, it's up by Haran. It's not on the book and your map, but that's where it's located. Ebla was one of these thriving cities of 5,000 or 6,000. And in 1974, there was an archaeologist digging down into the tell at Ebla, and he finds a bunch of shelves that have fallen together. And as they're taking these shelves apart, they find all these clay tablets. And you can see that the writing on the clay tablets is cuneiform. Writing came into the world right around the year 3000 before Christ. So now we're looking at about 2000 before. And Ebla's tablets are not biblical in nature. They're like trade tablets, you know, what cities are buying what and where are things going. Well, in these tablets, the same 5 cities or 5 nations are mentioned that are mentioned in the Bible in the same order: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, Zor. They did exist. They weren't just made up places in this mythical Bible. I just thought that was interesting and wanted to share it with you. But the major part of chapter 14 is that these warring city-states have gone up against Sodom and Gomorrah, and they've stolen everything from Sodom and Gomorrah. They've taken the women, they've taken the treasures, and they've taken Lot, Abraham's nephew, captive. And one person gets away, and they make it back to Abram, and they tell him, hey, you know, Lot's a captive of these kings. And so Abram leads 318 of his kinsmen to rescue Lot. So we know that Abram's family, some of them have been following him, because Sarai is still barren at this point. He has no children of his own, but obviously brothers, other nephews, maybe cousins have followed him, and he takes these kinsmen and he rescues Lot, and he takes all this treasure, collects it back up, and starts heading back home to Hebron. Well, Hebron is about 25 miles away from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem wouldn't have been much more than just a small outpost at this time. Or who knows what it was. It would have been very tiny. But it says that Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who was a priest of the God Most High, so he's a priest of the same God that's communicating with Abram, who sent Abram on this huge trip out of Ur and out of Haran and into this land that will someday be the land of his kinsmen. And Melchizedek brings out bread and wine and blesses Abraham. And it's the first mention of any priest of a Most High God, right? Somehow, some way, this priest knows about the same God that Abram does. And it's very mysterious that we always talk about Melchizedek as having no beginning and no end. We don't know his genealogy, and we don't know any descendants that came from him. He is this mysterious power that comes out to bless Abram. And in fact, he prefigures Jesus Christ, the priest king of the heavenly Jerusalem. Remember, we talked about types in the Old Testament. Melchizedek is a type of Jesus. Jesus at the Last Supper brings out bread and wine and turns it into himself. I mean, but Melchizedek is the foreshadowing of this. And in fact, Abraham tithes Melchizedek from the recovered goods. He gives him 10% of everything that he has collected, and Abram keeps nothing for himself. Now, next time that you're listening to Mass, I want you to listen carefully. And the Father, when he is blessing the bread and wine, he's acting in the person of Christ, and the Holy Spirit is transforming the bread and wine into the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. Father has the option to read one of 4 Eucharistic prayers. And one of these Eucharistic prayers mentions Melchizedek. And I want you to listen for that when you're at Sunday Mass. It'll sound like this. Father will say, "Be pleased to look upon these offerings, the bread and wine that he has before him, with a serene and kindly countenance, and to accept them, as once you were pleased to accept the gifts of your servant Abel the just." Remember Abel and Cain? Abel the just is the one who brought the gift that was pleasing to God from his flock. Then he'll say the sacrifice of Abraham, and we're about to hear about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. And then our Father in the sacrifice of Abraham, our Father in faith, and the offering of your high priest Melchizedek. That's the Melchizedek they're talking about, the one we just read who brought out the bread and wine for Abram there by Jerusalem. So a holy sacrifice, a spotless victim. So next time you hear that in Mass, your ears are going to be going, I know who this Melchizedek is. All right, so let me move this over. Chapter 15, the covenant is reassured again to Abram. Here's Abram, this old man. He's moving all around. He's, left Haran. He's gone to Egypt. He's come back to Hebron. And he must have had, just like, wow, when are all these things you promised me going to happen, Lord? And so he is reassured by God, you will have children. And it says that Abram believed the Lord, and God, reckoned it to him as righteousness. And that's a verse, it's chapter 15, verse 6. That's one that you could highlight, because that one you're going to hear again when we get to the New Testament. St. Paul is going to say, Abraham's faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he says that in Romans chapter 4, verse 3, and he says it in Galatians chapter 3, verse 6. So when we get to New Testament, your ears will be ringing, because you'll say, I remember when that happened to Abraham, when the Lord told him that his faith would be reckoned to him as righteousness because he believed he would have children. In this same chapter, Abraham is told to prepare a sacrifice. He's told to go get specific animals for a covenantal sacrifice. And this was the way that men in the Middle East made sacrifices and covenants between themselves. If I was John Doe back then, and I wanted to make a covenant with my neighbor, we would get animals, we'd kill them, we'd cut them in half, we'd separate the two halves with enough room in between them that we could walk between them. And then the two of us would walk between those sacrificed animals, and we would say, may this happen to me if I break my covenant with you. May I be cut in half and killed. That's how covenants were made between men. So Abram has prepared all these sacrifices because God has told him, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I've already made it with you, but now we're going to do the sacrifice. We're going to go through what all men would do as they were making these covenants between themselves. So Abram separates the animals, all except the turtle doves. They're too small. And then he falls into this deep sleep. And in the vision, he has a prophecy of the chosen people's slavery in Egypt. He is told that his descendants will be ruled over by a foreign country and that they will be held slaves for 400 years. And we will get to that, right? It's Moses who's going to lead the chosen people out of Egypt. But Abram, even though he doesn't know Moses, Moses is another 1,000 years away from him. He's told by God that this is going to happen, but that they will be rescued. And then he sees a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the sacrifices. And this is God himself passing between the sacrifice and officially making this covenant with Abram. And he does it alone. Abram doesn't have to do it. God is enough to make it happen. So that happens at the end of chapter 15. Then we get to chapter 16, the birth of Ishmael. Right. Abram believes God, that God says you're going to have descendants through Sarah. But Sarai, she's not so believing. But Sarai does what Mesopotamian law allowed and sometimes required a barren wife to do. she takes one of her slaves and gives her to Abram so that they can have relations and have a child. And that's what you did if you were a barren wife, right? Your husband still needed to have descendants. So Hagar, she's not hearing God's voice. She's an old woman. She knows she's past the age of bearing children. And so she gives Hagar to Abram. And Abram has relations with her. And Ishmael is born when Abram is 86 years old. And Sarah deals harshly. You can imagine what would happen if a wife gives a pretty young Egyptian slave to her husband, and now this pretty young thing is walking around with this round belly, and she's looking at her, this old woman, with just scoffing at her, you know. Look, you can't give your husband children. I can. Well, Hagar gets uppity, and it makes Sarah mad, and Sarah tells Abram, kick her out of this camp. I know I gave her to you. It's not working out. She's out of here. And so is that son of hers. Well, Abram says, you do with her as you want, Sarah. You know, it's up to you. He's kind of the husband who gives in. But the angel of the Lord comes to Hagar. It says that in verse 7 of chapter 16. Angel of the Lord comes to Hagar, and he tells her, you go back to your mistress. You go back to Sarai, and you do what you're supposed to do. You know, he kind of talks her down. And then in verse 13, we actually hear that it was the Lord who spoke to her. Whenever you see in the Bible a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D for Lord, that means that they have translated the Hebrew for Yahweh. Yahweh was the name of God that was so holy that they didn't speak it out loud. And so we find out that this angel of the Lord is God himself. And you're going to see the angel of the Lord reappear in the Old Testament many, many times. And the church doesn't say, they know that when the Lord identifies himself, then they know that angel of the Lord was actually God. Many theologians believe that the angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ. It's Christ before he took a body on, and he is the one who's coming here and mediating. And so just an interesting aside. All of this soap opera type behavior of Sarah and Hagar and Abram leads to a huge crisis for mankind, actually, because in 571 AD, Muhammad, the father of Islam, will claim to be a descendant of Ishmael, and Islam will be born, and the wars between Islam and Christianity, the Crusades, the ongoing wars to this date between these religions, and especially with the Jewish faith, will continue. So it all led to things that were not very good. Chapter 17, God, right, just like with Noah, he said, we're going to have a sign of the covenant. With Noah, the rainbow was going to be his sign that he was never going to flood the earth again. Well, first, he changes Abram's name from exalted father to father of a multitude, which is what Abraham means. And he changes Sarai's name to Sarah, but both of them mean the same thing in Hebrew. They both mean princess. And so the change doesn't really change her status. She was a princess and she is a princess. And then he says, there's going to be a sign of this everlasting covenant between me and you. every male among you is to be circumcised. Well, and Abraham does it. And you gotta love him for doing it. You men can imagine growing men without any kind of medical painkillers, having the foreskin of their private parts circumcised. That was a huge sign. It was a huge thing for Abram to say, all right, that's going to be the sign of the covenant. Every male and for every new male that's born into us when he's 8 days old, he will be circumcised. And God makes a promise again through this covenant. He tells Sarah, who's now 90 years old, that she's going to bear a child and he's going to be named Isaac. And Isaac means laughter. And he says, Ishmael will be the father of 12 princes and a great nation. So this child from this slave woman is also given a promise. But God says, even though I will bless Ishmael with these 12 princes for sons, my covenant is going to remain with Isaac, the son that I'm going to give to Sarah. So then we get the mysterious visitation. Now the covenant is coming to a head. God is taking action. And if we read in chapter 18, verses 1 and 2, it says, the Lord appeared to him, to Abraham, and 3 men stood in front of him. So Abraham looks out and he sees these 3 men coming at him. And there must have been something tremendously special about him, because Abram falls all over himself to be nice to them, right? He begs them to come and stay with him. He kills one of his best calves, right? He tells Sarah, go make some food for these men. So he recognizes immediately there's something special about them. And then it says, Lord said, right, one of these 3 men is God. And he says, I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And remember how in the very first lesson I said God is spiritual, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, up until the time Jesus Christ comes into the womb of the Virgin Mary, God is without body. But both God and angels can appear as bodies if they want to. They can take on the form of a body. And it's still a remarkable thing today. I mean, we probably see many more angels than we ever know about when they do that, when we're in some kind of desperate trouble and somehow a stranger appears, gives us a hand, and disappears. You know, they may drive a car, they may walk up to us, but there is a great feeling in the religious community that we deal with angels much more than we think. So one of these men is God, and he says, you're going to have this son. Well, Sarah's in there. She's patting bread. She's cooking away. And she hears this, right? She's 90 years old, and she bursts out laughing. And, and it's interesting because God, of course, he's all knowing. Doesn't matter if she's in the tent and there's probably a lot of noise. He knows that she laughed. And he gets in her face. He says, hey, you were laughing. And she says, no, not me. And he says, yes, you were. And hence the name Isaac, laughter, right? He brought this huge joy into their life, a joy that Abram had earlier laughed at the same thing. You know, he didn't believe at his age that he could become a father with Sarah. The other 2 men head off to Sodom and Gomorrah. And in chapter 19, verse 1, it's revealed to us that these other 2 men are angels. But the Lord, who's the third man, he stays with Abram. And this is the first time in the Bible we see somebody interceding for somebody else. Abram is interceding for Sodom and Gomorrah. God tells him, these are wicked people. I'm going to destroy them. And Abram's like, oh, no. What if there are 50 righteous men there? And God says, oh, okay. If there's 50 righteous men, I won't destroy everybody. And then Abram's like, well, what if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? And every time God is like, okay, you're interceding for them. All right, if I find even 10 good men, I will not destroy them. But God, of course, he's all knowing. He knows he can't find 10 righteous men in Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we move on to chapter 19, which is a disturbing story, right? These two angels in the form of men knock on Lot's door, and Lot invites them in, and they go in, and all the men of Sodom come running to the door and start screaming that they want these men so that they can have sex with them. And Lot goes outside and he's almost torn apart. He's telling them, no, you can't have these visitors. But he does say, wait, I've got 2 virgin daughters, but let me give you those. And but God steps in here through his angels, and instead the angels blind the men at the door so that they can no longer beat it down. And then the angels tell him, we're going to destroy these 2 cities with fire and brimstone, and you and your family got to get out of here. And Lot, in a strange thing, he's like, oh, you're going to destroy the cities and everyone in them. I don't really want to go to the hill country. It's so far away. I'd rather go to this little town. My wife likes cities, and we don't want to live in the hills. And the angels are like, oh my gosh, all right, you can go to the little city. And they actually transport them to this small town outside of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they warn them, do not look back at Sodom and Gomorrah. But his wife looks back, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. And there is an interesting formation that in the Holy Land that they attribute to being Lot's wife, because it looks like a salt figure of a woman. So then on to the next bizarre happening. Now his wife is salt. Lot decides, okay, I better go to the hill country. I mean, that was pretty awful what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe I don't want to stay in a small town. So he goes to a cave in the wilderness with his 2 daughters. And his 2 daughters are like, oh my gosh, we're out here in this cave. We're never going to meet men. Let's get our dad drunk and have sex with him and have a couple babies, which they do, the Moabites and the Amorites. And again, we see the culture of that time stepping in. You want your own tribe, your own people to be descendant from a beautiful woman who was beautiful even when she was in her 90s, so beautiful the Pharaoh would steal her for his harem. But your enemies, you want your enemies to come from bad places. And remember back from last lesson, we had Ham, who was Noah's son, and Noah gets off the ark, gets drunk, lays around naked. Ham sees him, goes to his brothers, elbows him. Hey, did you see Dad? He's drunk and he's naked. And very disrespectful. And so all sorts of tribes that the chosen people are going to fight with come from Ham. Same thing with Lot's daughters. Their children become the Moabites and the Ammonites, who were big enemies of the chosen people. So it is interesting to note that Sodom and Gomorrah disappear from history, but the reports of Greek and Roman writers tell us where those 2 cities were actually located. And those places are now covered with about 15 feet of Dead Sea water. I had the privilege of being able to go to the Holy Land and to see the Dead Sea. And the Dead Sea is so salty that the density of the water is greater than the density of human flesh. So you cannot sink when you get in the water of the Dead Sea. You float. You just can't sink because the water's so heavy with salt. And the Dead Sea rose. Sodom and Gomorrah were located along its shores, but climate change, yes, climate change has been happening for a long time. It ebbs and flows, and the waters of the Dead Sea have risen through the millennium. And so now those two places would be under 15 feet of that water, hence why there are no archaeological digs over them. But that was chapter 19, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, chapter 21 is the birth of Isaac. Abraham's now 100, Sarah's 90, Ishmael's 14 when Isaac is born. Once again, now that Isaac is born, right, Sarah sees Ishmael playing with her child, and she gets worried about who's going to inherit what. I don't want anything going to this slave's son. So she orders Hagar and Ishmael to be kicked out of camp again. And Abraham is sad, right? Here's his son. He's 14 years old. They, I'm sure had this good bond between them. But God tells him, do what Sarah says. I will take care of them. And it says God saves them in the wilderness and was with Ishmael. In verses 20 and 21, we know that Ishmael was okay, and so was his mom, because it says Ishmael grew up and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So God writes with crooked lines. He let Sarai give her slave girl. He let this boy come into the world, and then he took care of him. Chapter 22, God tests Abraham. So now Ishmael is out of the picture. Isaac is there. Abraham loves Isaac. In chapter 22, we have what A.E. Spicer, who is a very renowned historian of the Middle East back in the 1930s, he called Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 12, the profoundest personal history in all the recorded history of the patriarchs. So let's read that together from the Bible, because when I hear it at Mass, I oftentimes cry. It's such a beautiful story and a beautiful type of Christ, which you will see. So turn to page 49, which is chapter 22 of Genesis. After these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only begotten son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering upon one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Then Abraham put forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only begotten son, from me." A powerful, powerful tale of our forefather and the faith that he had in God, that he would offer up his only begotten son, and that he would believe that God himself would provide the lamb. Isaac was a type of Christ. He is probably, in my own opinion, the strongest type of Christ in the entire Old Testament. He was the only son of his father. He carried the wood for the sacrifice on his shoulders, as one day Jesus Christ would carry the wood of the cross on his shoulder. And he chose to become a sacrifice, right? He already knew, he saw there was nothing else to sacrifice. And his father was an old man, and he was not. He was a strong young man. He could have run away, but he allowed his father to bind him. It's a remarkable tale of faith. And who is it that comes to save him? The angel of the Lord, right? The pre-incarnate Jesus, who sees this and knows that someday it will be him who's taken on a body and will be sacrificed. And he will be the lamb that God finally offers up. God says to him, "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only begotten son, I will indeed bless you." Chapter 23 describes the death of Sarah. And in it, Abraham buys land with a cave in which to bury his wife. And it's the first commercial transaction you see in the Bible also, right? Abraham is heartbroken. Sarah has been his wife for over a century. And now he needs to bury her in this foreign land. He doesn't own any of the land. He's basically just using the land. But to have a burial place, he has to buy it. So he talks to these pagans, and obviously the pagans recognize in Abraham something great because they like him, right? They respect him. And they're like, "Abraham, you don't have to give us any money. You can just bury your wife in this cave. It's okay." Abraham is, "No, this piece of land has got to be my own." And so they do. They sell it to him. And it's the cave of Machpelah. And people in the Bible that are recorded as being buried there, of course, Sarah is the first. But later, when we see Abraham's death, he's buried with his wife. So he's in the cave of Machpelah. And then Isaac, later on, we'll read about Isaac dying. And he goes to the cave of Machpelah. And Rebecca, his wife.
Mausoleum.
It's not a mausoleum. It was a mosque for a while. What happened was Joseph, with the coat of many colors, he goes into Egypt, right? His brothers sell him into Egypt. We'll get to that story. But Joseph, when he dies, he says, "Take my bones with you when you leave this land, because I want to go with my people." And so Joseph's bones are in the cave at Machpelah. Well, in 571, we said Islam rose up. Well, Abraham, right? He's the father of Ishmael, who Muhammad believes he's descended from. And so Islam takes over the cave of Machpelah. And then later, the Crusaders come in and they take it away from him, and they build this basilica on top of it. And Islam rises again. They take it back and they make it into a mosque instead of a basilica. And then in the 7-Day War back in 1967, Israel takes back Hebron, and that's where the cave of Machpelah is, and where the bones of both faiths lie. And so Israel, they didn't allow any type of archaeological digs to occur. They left the mosque sort of as it was, but they divided it in two. They made half of it into a synagogue, half of it into a mosque. And then a terrible thing happened. I think it was in the 1990s, where some Jewish settlers came in and found around 20 Muslim people praying in the mosque, and they killed them. And then there was a huge standoff. The outside of the building is now riddled with bullets. But
many people died.
Yep, many people did die. And so a very important place for the history, but also of Christianity and Islam and Judaism, right? It's where the bones of our forefathers and foremothers lay. So
is that pretty peaceful now area? You don't hear anything on the news about
it? Kathy is here with me, and she was asking, is that a pretty peaceful area now? And the answer is, it's more peaceful, but it's always on the brink of war. And so occasionally you will hear of mortar exchanges. And even when I went to the Holy Land, there was a war. There was bombing going on. So part of our tour had to be changed. But that was on the West Bank. And so, yeah, it's still a hotbed, Chapter 24, Isaac and Rebekah. We heard about Isaac. Here's a great love story in the Bible. Abraham doesn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. And the reason he doesn't want that is not because he doesn't like Canaanites and he hates pagans. It's because he knows that if Isaac marries into people who worship many gods and have idols, that it's very likely that Isaac will start to practice the faith of the pagans. And so he wants his son to marry somebody out of his own family. So he sends his servant Eliezer back to his brother Nahor in Haran. So he makes that big long trip back to Haran, loads up camels with bunches of treasures, and kind of makes a deal with God about how he's going to identify this woman who's going to be good enough for Isaac to marry. And he says, you know, I'm headed through here in the desert. I'm going to go to an oasis. I know that the women come to get water there. I'm going to tell these women that I'm thirsty, and one of them's going to offer me a drink, and she's going to offer to water my camels, and that will be Isaac's wife. And exactly what Rebekah does. And so Nahor's daughter Rebekah becomes Isaac's wife. We're introduced to Rebekah's brother Laban, who we're going to read about a lot in this next week as we read our next assignment. Not the most upright man in the world. But Rebekah agrees to go back to Hebron with Eliezer. And so they head back. She looks out, and you know, after they've crossed all this desert, and she sees a man walking towards them, and she says to Eliezer, "Who is that?" And he says, you know, "That's Isaac. That's your husband." So Isaac takes her into his tent. They have relations. And from that come twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And so Esau is the older one. He's born first, very red hair. In fact, Esau means red. He's a man of the wilderness. He loves to hunt. He loves to fish. He is his daddy's boy. Before we get to a lot of the story of Esau and Jacob, though, we hear about Abraham remarrying. Right? He's an old man, but he's not dead. So he remarries. He has a bunch more children. None of them carry on the covenant, but you occasionally will see their names listed in genealogies. And Abraham dies and is buried in the cave of Machpelah with Sarah. We see Ishmael's genealogy. We see that he does really become the father of 12 tribes. The twins that are born to Isaac and Rebekah, Esau first, Jacob hanging on to Esau's heel. The elder is dad's favorite, but God says the younger is going to serve, or the older is going to serve the younger one. So Jacob is mom's favorite. And it tells us Esau is this great hunter, and it tells us that Jacob, he's a quiet man, and he hangs around in tents. He doesn't go out in the wilderness. But, right, he's mama's boy, and so he learns how to cook too, and he's a good cook. And Esau comes home, and he's starving, and he says to Jacob, give me some of that pottage that you've made. It smells great. I need some food. And Jacob says, okay, I'll give it to you. You sell me your birthright. And Esau's famished, and he says, what am I going to do with a birthright anyway? So he despises his birthright, right? This is a very, very important. Your birthright is huge in that culture, and Esau treats it like it's nothing, and that is offensive to God. But at the same time, Jacob's a conniver, and Jacob, we're going to see him do some more conniving in these next chapters, and he will pay for that conniving. He will find out that other people can connive around him too. So that's all for next week. And our readings for next week, Genesis 26 through 50. And then I listed my picks, which are on your syllabus. If you can't quite read that much, at least read these key chapters. And other than that, we finished almost on time. So
26 to 50.
26 to 50 is for next week. And I'll stop the share right now, and I will stop recording so that people don't have to listen to anything else.